now. So while we're waiting for that to set up, hey, where'd you go? All right. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of this because it's basically going to be like picture in picture, and we don't necessarily need that. So thank you very, very much for sending in your reflections on the articles, what is the monkey sphere from Cracked, and then also Dunbar's number for your chapter in McRaney. Oh, there you go. Hey, Geneva. Oh, there you are. Hey, Geneva, just to let you know, we are live streaming this on YouTube. So if your internet keeps cutting out, we got you covered, okay? This will be available later. I did get a couple of comments about the language in the Cracked article, and I did kind of give you a heads up that the language was going to be colorful. It's a comedy website, and it kind of shows. So hopefully the article in the idea of McRaney kind of really helped solidify that in a more kind of scientific sounding way. So I got a couple of interesting ideas that were brought up by the article. So I hope you learned a lot. One of the ways that you can kind of see this, I want to be clear. When you read this article, it's really easy to kind of feel a wave of shame. And one of the things I kind of noted that people put in their article was, it feels really bad, you know, I care about people. And I'm like, I know you care about people. But the thing is that your brain only has the capability to really know, like maybe about 5 people. And then up to an acquaintance level or a less good friend level, you've maybe got about 150. That doesn't mean that you don't care. It's just the concept of a group larger than 150 people is really, really abstract. And it's really, really hard to think about that in terms of what that means. And so when we hear about tragedies that strike a great number of people, it does not necessarily mean that it doesn't necessarily mean that we're callous for not being able to process it the way we would if a close friend had something really bad happen to them. You know that friend, but knowing thousands and hundreds of thousands of people is really hard to do. The care that you have for those people, which I believe you absolutely do have, is going to look very, very different from the care that you have from somebody that you know really well. So you can kind of see how we're running into this a little bit. So I believe right now, and not to start class on kind of a macabre note, but 200,000 people have, give or take, have died from COVID-related causes. That is a huge number, and it's very, very difficult for us to actually process that number. Now, it doesn't mean we don't care. It doesn't mean that we don't mourn for those people, but because of how limited our cognition can be, it does mean that we're probably going to be able to care for the people that we know well in a way that we can't for a larger, more general, abstract group of people. So a few people were worried that this meant that they were callous or cold-hearted. You're not. Your cognition has limits. I also got some people who mentioned, I don't really know 150 people, and that's okay. You're not supposed to know 150 people really, really well. Can you imagine how much bandwidth that would take up if you knew everybody? That'd be a lot. You basically have the bandwidth to maybe know about 5 people, like super duper well, and then maybe another 20 or 30 people a little less well. But in general, you know about 150 different acquaintances and things like that. You know little things about them here and there. And so I'm glad this really made you think. If you have any other questions or comments for me about that article, feel free to email me. And if you still need a little more time to get that in, I noticed a few people when I was grading them earlier today hadn't turned them in yet. Make sure that you get those in. So I wanted to show you a couple of different things that I have put up on the website and on my Kadi so that you're aware of them. So I'm going to go ahead and share that now. And it's kind of nice to know that I don't have to yell to teach. I was so loud on the last one. I'm like, ooh, that sounds really bad. So I'm going to see how speaking with my normal voice with a little bit of projection works. I don't have to take as many gasping breaths of air. So where am I going? Hey. So if you go to my Kadi and you go to our writing assignment links, you will notice that I've added What Working Memory, a digital event celebrating the 9 lives of working memory. So if you go ahead and click on that, so we have our blog post by Stephen Lewandowski, and they talk a little bit, we're gonna start talking about working memory today and on Friday. The article that I want you to look for is this article by Nelson Cowan, who he's not the guy for working memory, but he's one of the top 3 working memory researchers. And so this is kind of an article about different ways to consider working memory, which we often tend to think of as short-term memory, but is not quite the same thing. Now, working memory is my field of study, so this is a good time if you have questions about memory-related matters to definitely ask me about those, because I know those pretty well. The other thing that I wanted to show you that I put up on my Kadi is your infographic project. So because of the pandemic, not all of you are here now, and additionally, I'd like you to maintain social distance where you can. Because of that, normally we'd be working in groups of 2 or 3 to make a video project. And in December, we would have a film festival. I'd bring snacks and we'd show each other's movies. Well, we really can't do that this year. At least I can't in good conscience have you do that. So this time, I would like you to create an infographic or an advertisement for a fictional product or service. I'd like you to develop your idea for that product and basically use 4 different concepts that you learn in this class to help you sell that product or advertise that product. So for example, repetition of the product name to boost people's likelihood of remembering it. Gestalt grouping principles for the logo. Maybe you use a Naven figure because everybody loves the Naven figures. And definitely meet with me or email me by the day before Halloween. Oh, Halloween's on a weekend. Oh dear. We'll have to stock up on candy possibly. But you need to meet with me by October 30th to let me know if you're on the right track. The project is due on December 9th at 11:59 p.m. So I get a wonderful birthday present because my birthday is on the 10th. I get a wonderful birthday present of your projects. So make them good. All right, does anybody have any questions so far? There is a rubric as well. As you can see, 50% is content, 50% is creativity. This should give your grade a nice boost. Any questions? All right, so I mentioned last time that we were going to talk about cross-modal attention. And in particular, we already kind of talked about the ventriloquist delusion, which is the finding that when you are watching a movie or you're watching TV and you're getting that simultaneous visual information and that simultaneous auditory information, we often tend to find a phenomenon known as visual capture. So visual capture is basically the idea that your visual sense has a tendency to override your other senses. So in the case of the ventriloquist illusion, visual capture works to make you perceive sound as coming from the speaker's mouth rather than coming from the physical location of the speakers itself. So we've already kind of talked about how this works in an auditory and a visual domain. Now let's talk about what happens when we cross visual information with touch-based or tactile information. So we're gonna watch a lot of videos. So normally what I would do for this first illusion, the rubber hand illusion, I have a terrible plastic bloody Halloween hand. It's not very realistic and it doesn't look like most people's hands. But the idea is that with the rubber hand illusion, you can actually make somebody feel or believe that a rubber hand has become their own hand. So we'll watch a video of that in a minute. And then I'll talk about these other two illusions that we are going to watch, something called the body swap illusion, and then something called the body size effect, or sometimes cutely referred to as the Barbie doll effect. Yeah, it's definitely better to not yell. I didn't realize how yelly I was until I listened to it. I'm like, ooh, I don't like that. All right, everybody good? All right, so here is the rubber hand illusion. Okay, so I don't know that I necessarily buy that it's connected to neuroplasticity myself, just because those connections take a really long time. Now, you'll kind of notice that for this illusion to really work, you have to be stroking the actual hand and the rubber hand at the same time. So what ends up happening is that you're looking at this hand that's being stroked that is not your own, and at the same time your actual hand is also getting stroked simultaneously, but your brain is basically overriding your tactile sense with your visual sense. And it's basically saying that whatever you're feeling must be because of the rubber hand that you are actually seeing that is being stroked. And by the way, when he did the hammer thing, he's not actually hitting their real hand with a hammer. He's just like lightly tapping it and people freak out. So that is one of the first things that can happen. So we can basically take this idea and we can extend it to something called the body swap illusion, where we basically believe that our body has been swapped into a mannequin. All right, and make it bigger so that y'all don't see how much epic rap battles of history I watch.
Henrik Ersson på Karolinska institutet i Stockholm.
Now, I will kind of mention, by the way, that this is all going to be in Swedish, except for the parts where the researcher talks. And I'll kind of explain what basically happened after we watch the video. That basically make them see from the perspective of a mannequin, where you can even very lightly touch a knife across the mannequin's stomach and it will feel like it is going across your actual body. So yeah, that's kind of an extreme case of a study, but this same laboratory actually looked at something called the body size effect. So the same idea being using those goggles to basically create a situation where you feel now, instead of your body being implanted into a mannequin, into maybe something the size of a Barbie doll, or in one case, a giant pair of pants. So this actually comes from the same laboratory. There's no narration here, so you don't have to worry about the Swedish that we don't understand, but I will kind of walk through what is happening as we watch the video. So in this case, we're getting the exact same setup that we had before, except in this instance, this participant believes that their body has basically been put into the size of something that's like, does anybody remember My Buddy? Like that looks larger than an American Girl doll for sure, but a large size doll. Let's go ahead and call it a large size doll. So he just floated that cube by the feet of the doll so that the participant sees the cube. You can get a pretty good idea of what size the person thinks their body has now become by asking them to estimate the size of the cube. So one of the things you're going to see the participant do is they're going to hold their hands up like this or like this to basically register how large they think the cube is. And so that can actually be really useful data and let us know what size the person actually perceives themselves to be. So let's see what this participant says. So about their size, notice that the cube is that is being relayed by the participant, it's like maybe about a shoulder width. That is definitely not the size of the actual cube that we saw. So they think they've shrunk. Now you're a tiny G.I. Joe. A giant pair of pants. He thinks he got bigger. So I gotta say, I want to go work in a lab where I get to bring in a giant stuffed pair of pants. I also thought it was really funny that the experimenter had on a shirt that said actual size. So hopefully you found that kind of interesting. And in all of these cases, visual information overrides tactile information and makes us believe that our bodies have been swapped. And in certain cases, either magically shrunk into the size of a G.I. Joe or blown up to a giant pair of pants. So now we're going to talk a little bit about multitasking or divided attention. So we'll go over a general definition. We'll talk a little bit about the gender differences that have been reported in multitasking, or rather the gender differences that are presumed to be in multitasking. And then we'll also talk about automaticity and practice. So the more that you practice something, the more automatic you become at that task and the less demanding it becomes on your attention. So what is multitasking? So another way of thinking about multitasking is basically performing two or more tasks at the same time, such as driving and holding a conversation with somebody. So technically, the correct term for multitasking is divided attention. Our attention is being divided between two tasks. And in these cases, it is expected that we devote equal amounts of attention to both tasks. So when you're having a conversation with somebody while you're driving a car, they generally want you to be an engaged conversation partner. They do not constantly want you going, Yeah. Uh-huh. Right. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Right. They want you to actually engage with them. Now, many of us do engage in multitasking. So go ahead and hop on the Discord if you're on Zoom, or hop on the chat. How many of you multitask? Like, what are some different things that you multitask at? Do you watch TV while you try to study? Do you talk on the phone while you're driving in the car? What different types of multitasking do you do? I try to live chat while I'm working on an exercise bike, watching TV and doing homework. Yeah, that's one I definitely do too. I was one of those students who was like, I can listen to music and study at the same time. Yeah, I kind of could, but I wasn't really paying attention to the music. Music and homework, that's a pretty common one. Yeah, that, and Ash mentioned that too on the Discord, listening to music while doing homework or reading. So this is something that a bunch of us do, clearly. I cook and listen to music. I work out and listen to music. I live chat and I work out. So a lot of us engage in this multitasking, but it's probably not that effective. Have any of you ever tried to walk and text at the same time? How does that generally work out for you? Not good? Has anybody ever actually walked into anybody or anything while trying to text and walk at the same time? Yep. My sister famously likes to tell people, and you'll get a pretty good idea of the kind of person that I was when I was in college. Um, so I didn't have a cell phone until I was in graduate school, but I would read and try to walk at the same time. And I'm pretty sure I face planted at least twice on campus. And so that is the last time I read and walk at the same time. I don't even think I can walk and chew gum at the same time. I don't think it works out very well for me. But generally what we're gonna find is that when we are focused on multiple tasks and dividing our attention between them, what we generally tend to find is that we would be better off if we only did one thing at a time. If you're texting and walking, you're probably not texting as fast as you normally would. You're probably not walking as accurately or as quickly as you would. You would do both of those better if you were each doing them on their own. But because you've chosen to combine them both of them have a tendency to suffer. Now, that is not Dr. Gilchrist being preachy and telling you, don't text and walk. Texting's awful. I text, I walk, and I check my email while I walk. I still do it. I'm just asking you to be mindful. So there's often going to be a trade-off between how many things we pay attention to, what you can think of as the scope or the breadth of our attention, kind of like we talked about with attention as a zoom lens. But your attention is a finite resource. I dare any one of you to tell me that you have infinite attention. I don't think I will have anybody trying to argue with me on that one, at least. Your attention is a finite resource. And if you're paying attention to a lot of different things, that means that that's less attention that you can partial out for each one. So you're going to have a larger breadth, but you're going to have much less precision or ability to do as well as you would if you weren't dividing your attention between all of these tasks. So something to keep in mind. Now, there's this weird notion that I started hearing about, especially once I got more involved in attention research, this idea that generally women are better multitaskers. They can raise kids and do Zoom classes and go to work and do all of this stuff. So there's this idea that women are better multitaskers. Now, part of that is because in the past, by and large, they had to be. Women were by and large more involved in child rearing activities, maintaining the home, and things like that. Now, one of the reasons beyond this that women have been presumed to be better multitaskers is occasionally you will hear reports that there are some gender differences in an area called the corpus callosum. So if you've had me for biopsych or general psych, you might remember me talking about the corpus callosum a little bit. It's a white matter tract, so it's a huge fiber bundle of axons that basically connects your two hemispheres together, both the right and the left, and allows you to those two hemispheres to communicate. Remember that when we cut the corpus callosum, we get split brain syndrome. But there are occasionally people that talk about there being gender differences in terms of the corpus callosa. Generally, women have been reported to have more dense ones with a larger number of fibers. So there's this idea that because women have a larger, more dense corpus callosum, their hemispheres communicate with each other better. Not everybody has found evidence for some have found gender differences between the corpus callosum, but not everybody has. There's some research that supports this, but I have a feeling that if we looked at the corpus callosums between the genders, you would actually probably find more individual differences within a group than between the groups. So there's some evidence that supports this idea that women are better multitaskers, but it's not actually backed up by a lot of credible evidence. But sometimes people bring this up and I read about it in women's magazines. My doctoral advisor actually back in like maybe 2008 wrote a blurb for Glamour magazine. He was basically interviewed by Glamour magazine to talk about multitasking. Which was really odd. All right, does anybody need some more time here? Okay. So generally, here's what I will tell you. If you want to walk and text, that's fine. Please don't drive and text. Basically, the latest message seems to be please, 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 please stay away from cell phones while you drive. And I would actually argue that if you're a pedestrian, I think if you're walking around the Cody campus, it's not such a big deal. But if you're trying to cross Austin, just wait. Generally, we find that driving while using a cellular phone impairs your reaction time. So you brake later, you notice things less quickly, and it also impairs your driving ability. You're more likely to bob and weave inside and outside of the lines for the road and things like that. So generally, driving while using a cell phone tends to be very, very bad for your driving. And this is true even if the phone is hands-free. So I know what you're thinking. Well, of course, driving is going to be bad. You're using your hands while you're on it, or you're looking down at a screen. And certainly back when Blackberries were a lot more popular, that was absolutely true. So I'm going to share something embarrassing, but it's embarrassing to my mother, not me. My mom used to have a Blackberry when I was in graduate school, and she would like text and use the little keyboard while she was driving the car. And I would be sitting in the passenger seat with just, Mom, can you please not do that? So back when we had keyboards, actual physical keyboards on our phones, that was one thing. But now most of us can do hands-free and it still impairs our driving. Why? We're not using our hands anymore. So what's going on? So why would driving be worse if you're using a cell phone and you're not using your hands? Any thoughts? It's still a distraction, Ava said. Now, why is it still a distraction? What are you doing while you're on a cell phone? Right, you're talking, you're having a conversation, and guess what you have to use to maintain a conversation with somebody? Your mind. Your attention. So your attention goes into maintaining that conversation. And when you're using your attention to maintain a cogent conversation, that means that that's attention that you could have used for driving that you are using on a conversation instead. So many phones now, and my phone is actually one of them, actually when it shifts into driving, my phone shifts to do not disturb. I don't get phone calls, I don't get text messages, and it generally won't let me use it. And thankfully, my car actually has voice command, so I can control playing music on my phone by using little buttons on my steering wheel. We'll see if that's a good idea or not in the future. But it turns out that this kind of effect that cell phones have also does this with pedestrians as well. Ira Hyman and colleagues actually found that cell phone use while you are walking, first of all, impairs your walking ability, and it creates inattentional blindness, as we talked about last time. So he and his colleagues actually had a unicycling clown, which you would definitely notice, basically roll around a college campus in Washington. And only 25% of students that were using their cell phones noticed a unicycling clown. When your attention is focused on your phone, it can't be focused on other things. And those are very important things that you might miss. So be mindful. Like you have a wonderful, powerful, tiny computer in your hand, but it is very powerful and it has powerful effects on your attention. So keep it in mind when you use it. Does anybody need some more time here? Okay. So can practice improve performance? And there's a lot of evidence that shows that it can. So how many of you remember the first time you ever drove a car? How did that go for you, Emma?
I got in the car and my dad didn't tell me how to use the brakes, so I almost crashed.
So you got your gas and your brake confused?
Yeah.
How many of you confused your gas and your brake the first time you drove a car? Me too. Me too. And you were probably like, why do I only have to use one foot? Why can't I use one for the gas and one for the brake? And it's partially because if you're doing a manual transmission, your left foot's on the clutch. But if you don't have that in an automatic car, it's not really necessary. So most of us probably remember getting into the car for the very first time and feeling like everything took so much of our attention, checking the mirrors, putting on your seatbelt, figuring out how to turn, when to stop, looking for the cars behind you and in front of you and beside you, and remembering to check your blind spot, which is something Dr. Gilchrist never used to do. Had a couple of near misses, a couple of times, like a couple of near hits rather. Oh, I feel very sorry for those drivers. And for my bad driving behavior, of course. But one of the things that we find is that over time with practice, think about how many times you've gotten into the car and you managed to successfully get to your destination and you realize, how did I get here? I have no idea how I got there. It becomes so automatic to you that you don't really process it the same way you used to. And that can actually be really dangerous, y'all. A good majority of car accidents really tend to happen close to home. And that's partially because you're close to home and you don't really spend a lot of time exercising your attention. So there is evidence that the more that you practice something, the more automatic a task becomes and the less attention demanding it becomes as well. So Rich, Schifrin, and Schneider back in 1977 noted that there was a distinction between what we call controlled processes and what we consider automatic processes. So a controlled process is something that's very, very conscious. It requires a lot of attention and it's a very, very limited capacity. So controlled processes require a lot of attention. They're very conscious and we can really only engage in serial processing at that time. By the time that a process becomes automatic, the opposite happens. So whereas controlled processes have a limited capacity, automatic processes have an unlimited capacity. Whereas a controlled process requires attention, An automatic process does not. Whereas a controlled process requires serial processing, an automatic process requires parallel processing. So you can do a lot more automatic processes than you can controlled processes. So Schifrin and Schneider actually kind of tested this with memorizing groups of letters. So a memory set. So they would get a group of letters that they had to remember all the time. So the question is, they would be given a display of letters and they would be asked, does this display of letters match what you originally saw in the memory set? So they had a memory set and then they had a display of letters and they were simply asked, does this match what you saw or does it not? Now here's what's really interesting. Schifrin and Schneider basically added another factor. They added whether the mapping, so the memory set, was always consistent or varied from block of trials to block of trials. So with the consistent set, they would always, for example, get NJEM. That would be the letters that would be used the entire experiment. On the other hand, with a varied mapping, they would change from set to set to set to set. So the consistent map could become automatic because you were using and relying on that same set throughout the entire experiment. So you got more and more practice to remember it to the point where it became automatic. You don't really have that with a varied mapping because it's always going to change. So there's no opportunity for it to become automatic. Now, what I'd like you to focus on are our positive trials. So these are trials where the display matched the memory set. Notice what happens with the consistent mapping. Now, it's not a perfectly flat line, but notice that you can change the memory set size and the display set size, and it really still tends to operate somewhat in parallel, indicative of an automatic process. So throughout the task, it doesn't matter what the memory set size is. It doesn't matter what the display size is. If it's consistent, it becomes automatic over time. And this very flat blue line reflects that. What's interesting though, is when it varies, which is here in orange. When it varies, you can see that as display size increases, the longer it takes to make that choice of whether the display matches the memory set. And that's because this display keeps changing, which means it's not automatic. It means it has to be controlled. And remember that controlled processes are always serial. And you can see that the slope of this line increases and gets larger with increasing display size, indicating serial processing. So what this tells us is that the more we are presented with something to the point where we can consistently use it, it becomes automatic. I'm going to go ahead and skip this because it's kind of hard to explain, and I would like to move on and talk about disorders of attention, if that is okay with you. I'm not going to test you on what I just skipped too. That's a promise. So we're going to finish up by talking about different disorders of attention, and then we'll talk about neglect. So what are other types of disorders of attention? Now, I've already kind of talked about neglect. So that's a case where if you have damage to the right parietal lobe, it will cause you to not pay attention to the left half of your visual space. Are there others out there? Well, there is one called extinction, which is definitely not the best name in the world because there are a lot of other terms that involve extinction, but extinction is often something that occurs with people who are suffering from neglect. Generally, what will happen is they can't detect a stimulus on the opposite visual field when there's one presented on the same side. So here's kind of what I mean by this. I'm going to go ahead and pause share or stop share for those of you that are kind of zooming in. Oh, no, I didn't want to make it full screen. I just want to shrink it a little. There we go. Okay, so yeah, I don't like this thing. You get over there. Okay, so the idea behind this is, so let's say I've got something on my left and here's something on my right. So if I'm suffering from neglect, if I show, there are certain cases where people who have neglect can actually detect something on the left side of visual space. The problem is that with extinction, if I also present something on the ipsilesional or ipsilateral side of space, so on the same space as the lesion, all of a sudden, I can't detect what's in that contralateral hemisphere. So what's kind of happening is that there's a limit for attentional resources. I can only pay attention to so many things, and if I am a neglect patient, what we are typically going to find is that that actually damages my ability to deal with items that are competing for attention. So generally, if I have something that is on the contralateral side of my lesion, so if I have damage to the right hemisphere, that means the left field, what we're going to find is that I can detect what's in the left half of space unless I also present something on the right side. And at that point, I can no longer detect it. There's too much competition, and somebody who is suffering from extinction will have difficulty with that. So folks, this is all I had for today. We will finish up, I think we only have a few slides left. So we will finish up attention. We'll start talking about different types of sensory memory, short-term memory, and working memory on Friday. If you are not going to be here on Friday, or if you're not going to Zoom in, shoot me an email, because we are doing an assignment in class on Friday. If you're Zooming in, you should be able to do it. You're just going to need to send me your data after class. But if you aren't going to be here and you know ahead of time, let me know so that I can give you an alternative opportunity. You are going to hate this assignment, but it's a very, very short-term memory task. It's very hard, but it's designed to be hard. So don't beat yourself up. I will say that. All right, so we will talk all about that on Friday, and I will see you then. Take care.